June 4, 1942. The sky screams, not with engine noise, but with the terrifying, high-pitched whistle of falling death. It took the Imperial Japanese Navy 7 years to train the aircrew of their finest carrier group, the Kido Butai. Yet in just 5 minutes of utterly decisive action, those crews, those pilots, and 4 colossal carriers, the very heart of Japan's naval power, were transformed into colossal, flaming sarcophagi. This was not a fair fight. It was a brutal, asymmetric execution. The Japanese military machine, swollen with arrogance after Pearl Harbor, never saw the blow coming. They called the remaining American fleet a nuisance. They dismissed the few surviving U.S. carriers as relics, fit only for mopping up operations after the true decisive battles were fought. They looked at ships like the USS Enterprise, battered but still sailing, and saw a mere toy, easily crushed by their overwhelming superiority in numbers and experience. That fatal underestimation, that singular act of hubris, would ultimately seal the fate of the Empire of Japan. It is the story of how an underestimated adversary turned a tactical failure into a strategic triumph. Welcome to War Insight Stories. Today, we delve into the cataclysmic Battle of Midway, examining not the heroic narrative often told, but the intricate web of flawed decision-making, operational dogma, and sheer strategic malpractice that defined the Imperial Japanese Navy's greatest failure. This wasn't bad luck. This was a predictable disaster engineered by overconfidence. And it all centered around taking out a tiny, crucial island and the toy carriers protecting it.
To understand the shockwave of Midway, we must first appreciate the staggering height from which Japan fell. In December 1941, Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku delivered a masterstroke at Pearl Harbor. 6 carriers, the Kido Butai, had crippled the American battleships, rendering the U.S. Pacific Fleet functionally obsolete for months. The psychological impact was devastating. Japan believed they had secured a 6-month window, a period during which their naval supremacy was absolute and unquestioned. They were the masters of the sea, and the Americans were scrambling survivors.
The operational strength of the Kido Butai was unprecedented in naval history. Led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, this strike force was a consolidated fist of air power. Their doctrine emphasized overwhelming, swift strikes, utilizing their highly trained pilots and superior aircraft like the Mitsubishi A6M0. They possessed 10 major fleet carriers in total, compared to the U.S.'s 7, and critically, their 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented a firepower concentration the American fleet could barely counter, even at full strength. Following initial victories across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, Japanese confidence solidified into rigid, inflexible doctrine. They began to believe that their strategic successes were proof of inherent superiority, rather than temporary advantages gained through surprise and initial readiness. This arrogance manifested in a dangerous detachment from pragmatic assessment. They didn't just win battles, they dictated the flow of time and space on the ocean. Admiral Yamamoto understood the temporary nature of their victory window. He knew that America's industrial might was their true enemy. Therefore, his central goal became forcing a decisive engagement that would annihilate the remaining U.S. carriers, the ones they hadn't sunk at Pearl Harbor. His solution was Operation MI, the invasion and capture of Midway Atoll, designed as an irresistible bait to lure the wounded American fleet into a trap, crushing them permanently. But Operation MIA was fatally flawed from the drawing board, built on the assumption that American resistance would be disorganized and slow. It required 2 things: the absolute secrecy of the plan and the total inability of the Americans to concentrate their forces. Japan assumed that 2 U.S. carriers, the Lexington and the Yorktown, were sunk or critically damaged after the Battle of the Coral Sea, an engagement that had just occurred a month prior. This miscalculation of American strength was the first crucial domino to fall. The invasion fleet for Operation MI was gargantuan, a testament to sheer naval volume. However, Yamamoto committed the classic error of strategic dispersion. He scattered his forces across thousands of miles of ocean, dividing his carrier group from his battleship force and diverting substantial assets north for a simultaneous distracting attack on the Aleutian Islands. Instead of a single, concentrated knockout punch, the IJN prepared a series of jabs, believing any single one would be sufficient. The Kido Butai, Nagumo's strike force, was tasked with destroying Midway's ground defenses, then refueling and preparing for the inevitable American carrier counterattack. The operational assumption was that they would have plenty of time to rearm their aircraft, switching from land attack bombs to armor-piercing torpedoes, before the American fleet could possibly arrive. This critical, scheduling-based assumption, the belief in their own perfect timeline, created an Achilles heel that fate would exploit mercilessly. While the Japanese were planning their irresistible trap, across the ocean, the Americans were dealing with a different reality, a frantic race against time and intelligence. They knew the attack was coming, thanks to the tireless work of cryptologists who had broken the Japanese code JN25B. Station Hypo, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, was decoding just enough of the plan to understand the target, referred to in the intercepted messages only as AF. The Americans needed certainty. They devised a brilliant yet simple ruse. They sent an uncoded message from Midway reporting that the island's water desalination plant had broken down. Days later, they intercepted a Japanese message complaining that AF was running low on fresh water. The mystery was solved. AF was Midway. The Americans knew where, and critically, they knew when the attack would begin. Knowledge, in this war, was the only asset they truly possessed in abundance. The U.S. Pacific Fleet Commander, Admiral Chester Nimitz, faced an impossible choice. He had only 3 carriers, the Enterprise and Hornet, part of Task Force 16, and the critically damaged Yorktown, Task Force 17. The Yorktown had just limped back to Pearl Harbor after the Coral Sea, estimated to require 3 months of repairs. Nimitz gave the repair crews 72 hours. He knew that 3 carriers against Nagumo's 4 was a terrible gamble, but 2 carriers meant certain defeat. Under the relentless pressure of the clock, the Yorktown was patched up just enough to sail. She was not battle-ready, but she was operational. Her contribution was arguably the greatest single feat of naval engineering recovery in the entire war, driven by the knowledge that the fate of the Pacific rested on her patched-up flight deck. Nimitz centralized his command. We will meet them northeast of Midway. This positioning was key, placing the U.S. fleet outside the range of initial Japanese scouting planes, turning the hunters into the hunted. Let's look closely at the toy carriers, specifically the USS Enterprise, the Big E. While smaller than some of the massive IJN carriers like Kaga, the Enterprise represented American operational resilience. Her air groups, though lacking the combat experience of the veteran Japanese crews, were equipped with the SBD Dauntless dive bomber, a surprisingly rugged and highly accurate weapon platform that would prove devastatingly effective against the thin-skinned targets of carrier decks. Crucially, the Japanese had a deeply ingrained, almost ritualistic operational weakness that was about to be exposed. Their procedure for preparing aircraft involved taking the entire strike package below deck into the cavernous hangar bays to de-arm and rearm. This was safe, orderly, and agonizingly slow. In contrast, the U.S. carriers had slightly faster, more flexible procedures, often conducting simultaneous maintenance and fueling operations on the hangar and flight decks, a riskier but vastly quicker process when time was life. Dawn, June 4th. The Japanese first wave launches against Midway. The defense is spirited but overwhelmed. Nagumo's priority has been met. Now, the fateful chain of errors begins. He had kept half his strike force armed with anti-ship torpedoes and bombs, ready for the American fleet he expected later. But the Midway attack leader reported that a second strike would be necessary to truly neutralize the island's defenses. Nagumo was trapped by his own doctrine. To prepare for a second Midway strike, he ordered the reserve aircraft to be completely rearmed with general-purpose bombs for land attack. This decision, seemingly innocuous, set in motion the process of moving torpedoes and armor-piercing ordnance back down to the lower magazines, temporarily cluttering the hangar decks and fueling stations with highly unstable munitions.
At 7:28 a.m., a staggering blow. A belated Japanese scouting plane from the heavy cruiser Tone, which was launched 30 minutes late due to a catapult malfunction, another small but crucial operational failure, finally spotted the American fleet. The message was cryptic. 10 ships, apparently including a carrier, proceeding eastward. Nagumo was instantly plunged into operational paralysis. His ready planes were armed for land attack, useless against a fleet. His reserve aircraft were midway through the slow, chaotic process of rearming.
The operational timeline had collapsed. Nagumo faced a dreadful choice: launch the land attack planes immediately, achieving nothing against the carriers, or postpone the launch, rearm the planes with anti-ship weapons, and risk being caught by the American strike before he could launch his own counterattack. In the chaos, he committed the most strategic blunder possible. He chose the third option, delaying while ordering the immediate switch back to anti-ship weapons. Below decks on the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, hundreds of unsecured torpedoes, bombs, and fuel lines crisscrossed the hangar decks. They were in the most dangerous condition possible, fueled, armed, and packed close together. It was a giant floating bomb waiting for a match. The hubris of expecting a perfect timeline had created the perfect target. Meanwhile, the American air groups were already launched. Task Force 16, comprising the air wings of the Enterprise and Hornet, struck out. The flight to find the Japanese fleet was fraught with navigational errors and terrible luck for the American torpedo bombers, the TBD Devastators. These obsolete, slow aircraft flew low, straight into a wall of deadly Zero fighters, attempting heroic but suicidal attacks. Squadron after squadron of torpedo bombers were decimated. VT-8 from the Hornet was wiped out entirely, all 15 aircraft shot down, only one pilot survived. VT-3 and VT-6 fared only slightly better. They failed to hit a single Japanese carrier, but their sacrifice achieved something far more valuable than a successful strike. They dragged the entire Japanese Zero air patrol down to sea level. This was the single crucial moment of vulnerability. By 10:22 a.m., the Zeros were low, exhausted, and refueling, having just dispatched the desperate torpedo attacks. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the shield of the Kido Butai, was completely out of position, struggling to regain altitude. The sky above the carriers, for a fleeting, terrifying moment, was empty. And then the high-pitched whistle returned, but this time it was from directly above. Coming down through the thin, empty air were the SBD Dauntless dive bombers of the Enterprise and the Yorktown. They had arrived at the exact perfect moment, led by Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, who, through sheer luck and tenacity, had followed the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer straight to the carriers. The Japanese crews below deck heard the sound, but their anti-aircraft guns were too slow, too busy tracking the low-level torpedo attackers. The Dauntlesses plunged, dropping heavy armor-piercing bombs onto the exposed, fueled, and armed hangar decks. It was not mere damage, it was detonation. The first bomb struck the Kaga and the Akagi simultaneously. On the Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, 2 bombs detonated amidst the rearming area. Fuel lines ruptured, cascading aviation fuel over the stacks of exposed ordnance. The result was not just an explosion, but a self-sustaining internal furnace that vaporized everything structural. The carrier was doomed immediately. Nagumo himself, shocked and narrowly escaping the blast, had to be persuaded to evacuate his command. Minutes later, the Soryu suffered the same fate. 3 hits, centered directly on the elevators, ensuring the fires spread vertically throughout the vessel. The concentrated power of the Kido Butai, 4 carriers, had been neutralized in less than 6 minutes of dive bombing. 4 ships, each representing years of training and billions in naval investment, were reduced to uncontrollable infernos. The toy carriers, by placing their strike force in the perfect defensive ambush, had just won the battle. The Japanese were stunned. The disciplined, aggressive spirit of the Kido Butai was shattered. Only one carrier remained operational, the Hiryu. Led by Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, the Hiryu launched a desperate, last-gasp counterattack, determined to inflict revenge on the remaining American fleet. They found their target, the USS Yorktown, the patched-up carrier Nimitz had gambled everything on. The Hiryu's strike hit the Yorktown twice, crippling her engines and rendering her flight deck useless. But the American resilience held. Damage control crews were masterful, managing to keep the ship afloat, giving the impression to the returning Japanese pilots that they had only damaged a light cruiser, not a carrier. This misidentification further obscured the true scale of Japan's disaster, convincing them that the fighting was far from over. But the Enterprise had been untouched, and she launched the decisive final strike against the Hiryu. By 5 p.m. that afternoon, the last operational IJN fleet carrier was found and subjected to the same devastating attack that had destroyed her sisters. 4 bombs hit the Hiryu, plunging her into the same infernal chaos. Admiral Yamaguchi, a brilliant and respected officer, chose to go down with his ship, realizing the gravity of the defeat. In less than 24 hours, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, nearly 250 highly trained pilots, and over 3,000 experienced sailors. The sheer speed of the destruction was paralyzing. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the main battleship fleet hundreds of miles away, was forced to accept the unimaginable. The backbone of his offensive naval air power had been wiped out by the very forces he had deemed irrelevant. The strategic impact of Midway cannot be overstated. Before the battle, the IJN held the initiative, choosing where and when to strike. After Midway was irreplaceable, a critical blow due to their lack of a robust pilot training pipeline. The immediate consequence was the cessation of major Japanese offensive operations in the Central Pacific. The Japanese Imperial High Command was so horrified by the loss that they actively concealed the truth, reporting the loss of only 1 carrier to their troops and the public, reinforcing the institutional inability to learn from failure. Midway was the turning point, not because the U.S. suddenly became stronger, but because Japan suddenly became exponentially weaker. They squandered their veteran corps, relying too heavily on their opening advantage. The toy carriers of the U.S. Navy, specifically the Enterprise, survived the darkest days of the war, constantly operational, becoming the anchor of American power.